What concern of ours is the First World War? Was geht uns der Erste Weltkrieg an? Asked German President Joachim Gauck on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War in his speech in the German Bundestag. It's a question that he repeats 5 more times during his speech. What concern of ours is the First World War? It's a rhetorical device, clearly, but it's not a rhetorical question. It's a question, I think, that would be inconceivable in a British, French, or Belgian context, or indeed in many other countries around the world on this occasion. Undoubtedly, every nation has different views about the First World War, and these are defined and shaped by many different factors. Most prominently, I think, they are defined by whether you win or you lose the war. They are defined by whether there were positive or negative consequences to that war, and they are defined by whether that war results in feelings of pacifism or belligerence. Before I get into my talk proper, I just want to look briefly at these points, the winning and losing points, by comparing Britain and Germany. I know next week you have a talk about British views, so I won't, I think, stray too much into that territory. But if I could sum up the predominant British view of the war, I would say it was horrific, it was bloody, innocent people died, a lot of them. It was futile, perhaps. It was fought in the trenches. It was led by incompetent generals. It was started by the Germans, and the good guys won. In British national memory, the First World War is the defining conflict. No other war has demanded as many victims and has caused as much suffering. So I'd say it's very much the big one, the big war for Britain. Now, the comparison with Britain is instructive because its relationship with the war has always been so different to Germany's, and there are a number of reasons, and I want to just list 4. First of all, not least because Britain won and Germany lost. How a nation remembers a war will naturally differ according to the outcome of that war, as is clearly the case in this comparison. And all the more so because Germany lost the war unexpectedly. They didn't see it coming. Secondly, unlike in Britain, the First World War was not Germany's defining conflict, nor was it its worst war. Military and civilian losses were even greater in the Second World War, and the first has existed in public memory very much in its shadow as a first act of a much longer and even bloodier drama. Thirdly, in Britain, the war has been seen in some way as a defining moment, the end of an era. In British public conscience, the end of the war is associated with some positives. For example, the vote for women. Now, German women also got the vote in November 1918, along with other positive results of the German Revolution. But this is not something that Germans tend to remember. As another German president, this time Frank-Walter Steinmeier, remarked on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the end of the war, and he said in the Bundestag, a bit long this one, the revolution brought to all German parliaments general and equal suffrage. Finally, for the first time, also for women. It paved the way to the Weimar National Assembly, to a democratic constitution, to parliamentary democracy, the first in the history of our country. It also laid the foundations of the modern social state, the 8-hour working day, workers' participation in factory councils. All this epitomizes social progress that began then in the midst of post-war chaos. But Germans needed to be reminded of this by their president. Many simply did not know. Now, in Germany, the war also ended an era quite clearly, but for many, it replaced it with something much worse than what had gone before. So there are very few positive associations in Germany with this time because the republic that replaced the German monarchy was unloved by so many, and of course, ultimately, as we all know, it was ill-fated. And finally, then, a fourth point. While the First World War did not actually turn out to be the war to end all wars, as had been hoped, the wish at least was there for it to have been the war to end all wars. The wish was there in Britain, but it was not the wish of many in Germany, where many desired another war, which would this time bring the desired outcome, and which would undo the perceived wrongs of the armistice and the peace agreements. So there are quite important differences here in how the two countries remember their war. So that's just as an introduction to give some of the parameters in which I think German views of the war were formed. And in what follows in my talk today, I've divided my thoughts into 4 chronological sections. We'll look at contemporary views, so views during the war, post-war and interwar German views. We'll move then past the Second World War in a third part, including a brief look at the 2 different Germanys. And we'll finish with a look at the Centenary, when the war is finally remembered. So I'll click. Okay, so we'll start with contemporary views and reactions to the outbreak of the war. Now, in Germany in 1914, almost everyone believed that the war was defensive, that aggressive enemies had caused the war and were trying to feed Germany and its allies. This is what Germans had been told. And this is, of course, what everyone believed in Europe, as you can see here in these 2 conflicting newspaper reports. The British thought they were coming to the support of violated Belgium. And clearly they were, though this was arguably not the only motive for Britain to get involved in a continental war. There was no sense among the British public that decisions taken in London might somehow have exacerbated the crisis in the summer of 1914, just as there was no sense in Germany that the decision makers in Berlin might be to blame for the outbreak of war. In Vienna, Paris, St. Petersburg, patriotic support for the war was motivated by the conviction that the war that was about to be embarked upon was defensive, that it was a just war. And students of the origins of the First World War, you just mentioned some of them there, struggling to explain how the war broke out, are still asking that question. Well, somebody must have been the aggressor. It can't be true that everybody was fighting a defensive war. And I just like showing this. This is The Onion, the satirical newspaper that some of you may know, trying to explain the origins of the First World War. I'm hoping you can read some of that, including Ottoman Empire almost declares war on itself, and Area Drunkard declares war on Ireland. So you get a sense. It's just difficult to untangle, and it certainly was for contemporaries as well. Many in Germany also welcomed the war, and not just the military leaders who had been eager for a European war for some time. The German writer Thomas Mann spoke of a great, fundamentally decent, and in fact stirring people's war, and asked, "This peaceful world which is now collapsed with staggering thunder, had we not all been tired of it? Had it not become rotten with all its comfort?" Now, this statement, I think, could have come from many different countries. But as the war unfolded, it seemed initially to confirm the impression that Germany's armies were superior to those of her enemies. God seemed to be on Germany's side, so German soldiers felt. And there was further evidence in that then that this was indeed a just undertaking. Defeats and setbacks, which happened sooner than expected, were rarely, if ever, reported. An example of that is the famous Battle of the Marne, which Germans never knew about. In 1918, the defeat, when it finally came after 4 years of fighting, of sacrifices and hardship, was a surprise to Germans. When it became clear that the war was lost, the military were quick to ensure that the defeat was blamed on civilians. Thus, it was not Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, seen here flanking the Kaiser. The 2 of them, of course, were the Supreme Army Command. It was not they who signed the armistice agreement in the famous railway carriage in Compiègne, but the civilian politician Matthias Erzberger, whom you can see here in the center. And of course, as you may know, ultimately he would pay with his life for stepping up to the plate and saying, I will sign this on your behalf. So that then leads us to the end of the war and reactions to the end of the war. It's difficult, I think, to imagine conditions in Germany in 1918. The hunger, starvation, the millions of wounded and dead soldiers. Now add to this the fact that Germany was defeated and humiliated, and you don't get the same sense of relief that the war is over that contemporaries describe in British or French accounts, for example. There is more of a stunned disbelief. And of course, the starvation continues as the blockade continues, and the flu epidemic takes further victims in 1919. And there are some figures here. As we all know, when we look at figures like that, they really can't give you a sense of the suffering of individuals. But just to give you a sense, in the First World War, 800,000 civilians in Germany died as a result of hunger and malnutrition during and immediately after the war. A further 350,000 estimated victims of the Spanish flu, plus more than 2 million dead soldiers and more than 4 million injured and invalided soldiers. In comparison, in the Second World War, between 500 and 600,000 German civilians died and approximately 5.4 million soldiers. But what's interesting about that is these figures are not really, Germans are not really aware of that. If you were to ask a German in which war did more German civilians die, they would almost certainly say the Second World War, because that's where we have all the images of the area bombing, and we know just how many victims there were. But actually in the First World War, way more German civilians died. And just as a quick comparison with Britain, in the First World War, roughly 880,000 dead soldiers and 1.7 million injured and invalid, and 2,000 civilian casualties. Whereas in the Second World War, and the figure here that's important, I guess, is 380,000 dead soldiers, so far fewer casualties in the Second World War, which is, of course, one reason why the First World War is indeed, as I called it earlier, the big one for Britain in terms of having such an impact. Now, in Britain, too, there was disappointment that the promised land fit for heroes did not materialize, but at least there was initial joy that the war had been won, that the tyrant had been defeated, and the many victims of the war had seemingly not died in vain. Doubts about the futility of the war crept in later, of course, particularly when it no longer seemed so certain that Germany really had been the aggressor. The question then arose, why had so many men died so young, and had the war been futile? So that leads me then to my second part of looking at German views of the war, the post-war, interwar period, where we find very ambivalent views towards the war. Germany in 1918-19 seemed to many a much worse place than it had been in 1914. Its fortunes had been squandered, its prosperous Wilhelmine world order replaced by chaos and uncertainty. The country's honor had been damaged. In these conditions, it was not easy to attach positive attributes to the war or the war effort, other than that it was finally over. Not only had the expected victory eluded them, the world now blamed Germany for starting the war, for being the cause of all this suffering. It's difficult, I think, to deal with the death of millions against this particular background. There were competing views of the war in Germany at that time, with the left and the right attempting to commemorate and remember it differently. We think today mainly about the side that ultimately won, that of the extreme right, which ended up glorifying heroic sacrifice and depicting the war not as something to be feared and avoided, but something to be aspired to. After 1933, the Nazis usurped commemoration of the war and used it for their own aims. But before then, there were other types of remembering the war, for example, among Republicans, many, but not all of them, socialists. They mourned the dead while celebrating the fact that the lost war had at least undone the tyranny of the Wilhelmine monarchy and had ended a system that had been hated by many. What the war was for, what it had achieved, was thus seen very differently on different sides of the political spectrum. But whichever side one was on, remembering the war was not a simple process, but fraught with political considerations and tinged with ideology. An example of an interwar organization which focused on commemoration was the so-called Reichsbanner. And the Reichsbanner is this flag is another word for flag, so the Reichsflag. It was established by members of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the German Centre Party, and the German Democratic Party in 1924. It had managed to recruit some 2.75 million members just a year later. Their message was somewhat ambivalent, like I think their iconography is possibly somewhat ambivalent. I have no idea why this man is not clad in anything. But there he is. Even though they were moderate pacifists who aimed for international reconciliation, members of the Reichsbanner cultivated a distinct military style, and you can see here some of the parades, uniforms. Now, their socialist rhetoric of class alienated many potential supporters, especially Catholic workers. And it was not a refuge for everyone who wanted to commemorate or mourn. Women, for example, were not even allowed membership. Now, regardless of political persuasion, all thoughts of the war were overshadowed by the armistice and by the victors' peace treaty with its harsh conditions. Nothing united Germans more than the universal hatred of the Treaty of Versailles and its draconian demands of Germany. And I have a couple more. So you have here some anti-Versailles demonstrations. I have my doubts about this picture. It looks really very Photoshop, but there are many like it. I'm also not sure why everybody is wearing a moustache, but I guess perhaps they were. But here's another one. That one looks a little bit more authentic. And it says, Day of Versailles, Day of Dishonor, we want to be free of Versailles. Those types of demonstrations were commonplace. The war itself, or remembering the war, receded into the background because the focus was so much on the perceived unfairness of the blame for its outbreak and the outrage at the treatment of Germany by the victors. And then in addition to that, you have, of course, the so-called stab in the back legend. The home front had allegedly stabbed the fighting army in the back, and the army was actually undefeated at the front. And former Prussian Minister of War, Karl von Einem, called this the most immoral deed listed in the pages of German history. And you may just make out that the person there in the middle of that group is indeed Erzberger, who we saw earlier. Germans also had a hard time agreeing on how to remember the dead. While there were countless monuments and sites of memory at local level, it seemed difficult to agree on a national site of mourning. Now, there was in Berlin the Neue Wache, the new guard house in Berlin. This is a picture from 1941. And that was used from the 1920s as a site of commemoration. But it was overshadowed by the huge national memorial that was built in Tannenberg, the so-called Reichsehrenmal, the Reichs honorable honor, I can't talk anymore, Reichs honor statue, if you like. Now, this is some vast complex. Apparently, the space in between the towers is about 100 meters, so it is absolutely vast. And the contrast, I think, between this, and I have two pictures, I think, this and, say, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier or the Cenotaph could really not be more stark. This is not a place where you go and remember your father or your son, I would say. This is obviously also placed in Tannenberg, the place of a victorious battle. You may have lost the war, but you can still build this, in a place where there was a battle that you won. So the scale and design, I think, is so far removed from something that is about individual loss as I think can be imagined. It's quite staggering. It no longer exists. Countless local war memorials were erected in Germany, as elsewhere. But unlike French war memorials, for example, in which women and children often played a part in the iconography and showing soldiers returning home, for example, German monuments and memorials tended to portray the soldier as warrior, as we can see there, and as apart from the civilian population. With very few exceptions, these monuments did not carry pacifist messages. Where one such monument commemorated the dead and included the demand "never again," this met with local debate. But nationalist messages were also opposed, such as a monument with the Latin words, "Your unknown avenger shall rise from our mortal remains," which Republican newspapers objected to in turn. So there were a number of different organizations which attempted to establish commemorative events. For example, the so-called Volksbund, the People's League, tried to establish a public day of mourning, the so-called People's Mourning Day, Volkstrauertag. This was observed for the first time in 1924. By contrast, the first National Day of Remembrance, Armistice Day in Britain, was actually held in 1919. So you've got 5 years where nothing's really happening on that national scale. And of course, there is no 2-minute silence, as there had been observed by then for already 5 years in a row in Britain. 10 years later, though, the Volkstrauertag, which had been a nice idea, was replaced by the National Socialist Hero Remembrance Day, which gives it already a very different, has a different ring to it. And there's then commemorative stamps. I've included some here to show you that this, I think, is a very different type of remembering the war to what you see at the same time, perhaps in Britain. So the Hero Remembrance Day is organized by the Nazi Party and the Wehrmacht, and there's a clear nod, I think, to preparations for another war. This day focuses on hero worship and glorification of war, and not on the commemoration of victims. And having ceremonies at this preposterous Reichsehrenmal only added to this glorification. Before 1933, Republican veterans managed to devise their own language and practices of war commemoration, but they did so largely without involving the bereaved, which I think is, again, a difference. They remembered the war rather than the dead. Their slogan was, this is Republican veterans, like that of the German peace movement, "No more war," and the poster that Käthe Kollwitz came up with in 1924 for a pacifist socialist youth demonstration was indeed "No more war," or "Never again war" is the literal translation. And that was chosen in 2014 by the German government for the commemorative stamp. And interestingly, I seem to be spending a lot of time finding stamps for this. I also then found that East Germany also used the same image of the Nie wieder Krieg, Never Again War, Käthe Kollwitz image in 1970. Benjamin Ziemann reminds us that nationalist mythology of the war experience were not hegemonic in the immediate post-war period, and I think that's what my examples have shown. So while the right rejected any nostalgia or defeatism, for Republican veterans, the military defeat was a moment of political liberation from a corrupt and oppressive regime. To quote Ziemann, for both sides, mourning was almost a luxurious indulgence. So while there were sites of memory, to speak in Jay Winter's terms, there were not many or no sites of mourning in Germany at that time. And as the Weimar Republic gave way to National Socialism, mourning became even more relegated. Hero worship dominated. There could be no critique, no defeatism. Depicting the horror of war, alleging its futility was no longer an option. Literature and art that had dealt critically with the war and the themes of loss was soon considered degenerate by the Nazis. All Quiet on the Western Front, which came to epitomize anti-war literature around the world, was burnt by the Nazis in May 1933, here on the Opernplatz in Berlin, but in other university towns around the country, along with other un-German books. And Erich Maria Remarque, its author, was accused of the literary betrayal of the soldiers of the World War. And even before then, the screening of the Hollywood movie in 1913 was the subject of violent disturbances by Nazis in their thousands as they attempted to stop the film being shown. And where this failed, they interrupted the screening with shouting, the use of stink bombs and itching powder, and they released hundreds of white mice in the cinemas in an effort to try and stop this film actually being watched. Goebbels recorded in his diary in advance of attending a showing, and I quote, "We will teach the eunuchs a thing or two. I'm looking forward to it." By this time, Nazi violence against Social Democrats and other opponents was on the rise. So whereas in other countries, Remarque's message of the pity of war was received largely positively and fed into a general sense that the war had been futile and that wars were to be avoided at all cost, in Germany, many objected to this anti-war and defeatist message. As the Nazis prepared Germany for another war, sentimentality about the war of 1914 and criticism of warfare in general was no longer desirable. And that leads me then to part 3, views of the war after the Second World War. Now, when I put this slideshow together, I had here the iconic images that I'm sure most of you know of: Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, which all, of course, were completely obliterated at the end of the Second World War. But then you get sidetracked, don't you? And I ended up looking at my hometown, which is what this place is. And actually, it also looked like Dresden, Cologne, and Hamburg. But we tend to forget that this sort of destruction happened on a large scale and everywhere. And I found, talking about the memorials, we just found about this postcard from 1939 shows you what the war memorial in my hometown looked like before the war. And I think this shot's just as iconic as the one you may know from Dresden, from the Frauenkirche, with the angel. So that's why I've chosen those. They do make the same point, but they're just from a little place that nobody knows. So a new war, one that some German military officers had longed for almost as soon as the first had been lost, offered another opportunity for Germany to achieve what it had failed to do in 1914 to 1918. But this time, of course, the defeat, when it came, was total, devastating, and undeniable. After the Second World Wars, the horrors of the First were overshadowed. Even greater losses. But this time, Germany had been the battleground, as we can see in these images. In the First World War, there had been no such destruction and no fighting on German soil. The atrocities committed by German soldiers during the First World War, if they were acknowledged in Germany at all, paled in comparison with the Holocaust. And the aftermath of the First World War paled in comparison with 1945 and the division of Germany. And the division of Germany was the very thing that Erzberger had wanted to avoid and had feared could have happened in 1918, which was one of the reasons why he was so keen to sign the armistice. The First World War was not a topic that was given much consideration in Germany in these immediate post-war years. The emotive question of its causes seemed to be settled along the interwar consensus, most notably when French and German historians met and agreed a common line about this difficult question. There was more than enough uncomfortable history to come to terms with and to explain, or to explain away. But there remained a feeling that Versailles had been part of the problem, that even this can actually be blamed on Versailles, of the continuities from the First to the Second War, that punishing Germany so harshly had somehow contributed to Germany's unhappy post-war history and its attempts to right the wrongs of Versailles. And when finally a new public interest was sparked in the war during the early 1960s, it was once again more focused on the origins of the war rather than the war itself or any sense of trying to remember the dead. 1964 was, of course, the 50th anniversary of the war's outbreak, and there was much discussion of the war in Germany at that time. But there was nothing comparable to what was occurring in Britain at the time. For example, the famous BBC series The Great War, produced to commemorate the 50th anniversary with the interviews with veterans. Nothing like that happens in Germany. War poets do not become part of a German school curriculum like they do in Britain. There are no poppies, and there is no minute's silence. As West Germany prepared for the double anniversary, 50 years since the First World War, 25 years since the Second, a heated debate on who started the war gripped historians and the German public. Public discussions on the war focused on one groundbreaking and controversial thesis in particular, which I'm sure will be familiar to many of you, Fritz Fischer's view that Germany's government was more to blame for the outbreak of war than other governments. The debate that his views unleashed was huge. In the run-up to the 50th anniversary, the magazine Der Spiegel in particular fueled the discussion, and the media were a major contributing part to ensuring that this was not a debate confined to the pages of scholarly journals or lecture theatres. The controversy was more about contemporary and future Germany than it was about its past, I would argue, and indeed, I think the whole debate around the origins of the war had been about future Germany always, much more than about Germany's past, ever since 1918 and to this day. The international context of this debate is important here. This debate occurred at the height of the Cold War, with Germany still only very recently divided. The Berlin Wall had been built in 1961 when Fritz Fischer had published his first book. The fledgling Federal Republic was very much at the mercy of its allies. So drawing parallels between the origins of both wars, the First World War and the Second World War, and saying both had been Germany's fault, put West Germany's Western integration potentially into jeopardy. But the debate played out very differently in East and in West Germany. In the GDR, Fischer's views were not politically controversial, because Marxist historians had always believed in German war guilt, along with that of all the other imperialist powers. So this was not surprising or particularly exciting. But because 1945 was seen as a clear break in German history and in Germany's aggressive imperialist past, in the GDR, it was possible to say, well, that's not our history, that's West German history. We have made a clear break, and we are not like them. So while West German historians, politicians, journalists, and the general public wanted to stress the discontinuities in German history and make 12 years of National Socialism disappear as an aberration, for East Germans, it actually made sense to trace a link from Bismarck to Hitler, as indeed Hitler had done himself in this propaganda postcard, only he takes it right back to we got here, what does it say? The king. So we've got the king conquered, the prince shaped, the field marshal defended, and the soldiers saved and united. So that link from Bismarck to Hitler, or even further back in Prussian history, is something that East Germans were not at all uncomfortable with. And it just helped to show that the other Germany, West Germany, was the continuation of this inglorious imperialist past. In West Germany, by contrast, the topic was of grave political importance because the federal public did not see itself divorced from previous German history. If West German historiography could convince Germany's allies that Hitler had been a mere aberration, then arguments for reunification might eventually find favor. And so therefore, West Germany's standing in Europe and in the world was at stake. The potential damage that Fischer's thesis might do was immense. Not only did his interpretation call into doubt any hopes for a future reunification, but it also made the Federal Republic a potentially less desirable alliance partner in the West. The Fischer controversy, possibly more than the anniversary itself, had brought the First World War back into public consciousness, but it never played the same role in those years as it did in Britain. School children did learn about the war, and eventually the debate on the origins found its way into West German school books, but there was no tradition of commemorating and remembering the war. The Second World War was the nation's trauma. The First World War paled into insignificance. This is, of course, I'm sure you'll agree, one of the most striking differences between Britain and Germany in this regard. So by the time of reunification in 1989, two different versions of German history had been taught and published in parallel in the East and the West. Interpretations differed about the origins and the consequences of the war, and now the reunified Germany had to develop a coherent narrative. But still, the Second World War overshadowed the first in national memory. But there was some public interest around anniversaries when, of course, the media are keen to report on anniversaries. And there is a new confidence around in the new Federal Republic, which occupies then and now a position of economic and political strength at the heart of the European Union. So I move on to my final part, the Centenary. Now, the 90th anniversary of the war already saw a lot of public interest in Germany, like anywhere around the world, but it reached peak interest in 2014 for the 100th anniversary. The media frenzy that we probably all remember from 2014 in this country was certainly echoed across the channel. But this focus on the First World War, as it happened in 2013-14, was completely unprecedented in Germany. Books about the war topped bestseller charts. Bookshops were full of them. For the first time, books about the First World War outsold those about the Second. Yet again, the focus of public interest was on the war's origins. In an interesting parallel to 1964, once again, a controversial publication was at the center of this public discourse. Only this time, it argued the exact opposite of what Fischer had argued 50 years before. This time, it argued that Germany was no more guilty than other nations. In fact, guilt was no longer seen as a sensible concept to apply to this question at all. We were not supposed to interrogate the actions of statesmen, and we are not to attribute blame as historians. I'm talking, of course, about Christopher Clark's book, The Sleepwalkers, and his momentous intervention in the topic. Nowhere was his book debated more passionately and with more intensity than in Germany. Nowhere was he more feted and more reviled. Actually, possibly in Serbia, he was more reviled. So the pictures I have here, so that's the German edition, Die Schlafwandler, the Sleepwalkers, which is what caused the controversy. The book had already been published in Britain the year before and had not really made much of a splash. And then, as I say, Christopher Clark, very much feted, so people asking for his autographs. And then on the other side, you have the people who are demonstrating, here dressed in their pajamas. There was a big call out, come in your pajamas if you think that Christopher Clark's thesis of the Sleepwalkers needs to be objected to. And there's talk of falsification of history, who's the sleepwalker now? And on the posters, very interestingly, lots of citations of primary sources, the kinds of primary sources that didn't make it into Clark's book are there on these placards. So plucky pajama-wearing people there. At the same time, the German government seemed to be unable to make any serious plans on how to commemorate the war. A Green Party member of the Bundestag bemoaned in February 2014 that the special advisor for commemorative events had nothing yet planned, in addition to one round-table discussion that had already happened in January. Apparently, the homepage of the German Foreign Office, the Auswärtiges Amt, entitled Commemorating 100 Years of the First World War, was empty and hadn't even captured this one event that had already taken place. More startling still, in February 2014, the government confirmed in reply to a question from this Green Party member of the Bundestag, that Chancellor Merkel had thus far not a single commemorative event in her diary. I probably had more by then. Well, definitely had more, I'm sure you did. So that is really quite staggering, whereas David Cameron had already spent at least 2 years talking about pretty much nothing else. There was nothing afoot. Germany's government faced a dilemma: how to commemorate the war, given the fact that Germany had been made to shoulder the burden of responsibility for the last century. It still came down to the same problem that Germans had faced in 1918: how to remember a war, how to honor the dead in an aggressive war rather than in a defensive one. This was not a question that the French or Belgian governments had to face at that time, or indeed the British. Now, despite the lack of plans to commemorate at a national level, at a federal level, the Länder, the Bundesländer, the federal states, used the occasion to arrange impressive commemorative events and exhibitions throughout 2014 and indeed throughout the centenary years. And I just have here a couple: Bavaria and the First World War, and the Rhineland and the First World War. And you could go anywhere in Germany and find out about that particular bit and the First World War, possibly even my hometown. I didn't check that. But for the German government, this was a difficult topic to broach. Now, as a result of the public debate in the run-up of the centenary that I alluded to around Christopher Clark's thesis, there was an unusual, if not perhaps entirely unexpected, increase in public interest in the history of the First World War. At the height of the controversy, some 69% of respondents to a German opinion poll expressed an interest in the First World War, rising to as high as 77% in the 14 to 29-year-old demographic. I think that is quite staggering. That's probably no higher in this country, I could imagine. Those are quite high figures. At the same time, historians engaged in an unexpectedly ferocious debate about the causes of the First World War. And I just have here an example of the kinds of display that you're completely used to, I think, in British bookshops, but that actually was quite unusual in Germany. The way that the debate unfolded in Germany in the centenary year showed that the question of national honor was still of considerable importance when it came to how Germans discussed the origins of the war. When Clark was read by the German public, as well as by many German historians, as absolving Germany of the responsibility that it had shouldered for 100 years, there was a palpable sense of relief in many quarters. His revision of the old consensus was, in Stiegförster's words, and I quote, "balm for the soul of more self-confident, educated citizens, at a time when Germany is once more a great power on the continent." In 2013-14, a huge public interest was fueled by willing journalists and other historians who were only too keen to cash in on this newly found enthusiasm for all things Great War. Indeed, even the name Great War, der große Krieg, was widely adopted in Germany during the centenary debates for the first time. Until then, it had been the War of 1939 that had deserved that name. If there had been a consensus of sorts 50 years after the Fischer controversy, then Christopher Clark's book offered a welcome alternative interpretation on the question of the origins of the war. And I wonder actually what Germans would have discussed in the centenary year had it not been for the publication of Christopher Clark's book. Given that the government wasn't really doing anything, had there been none of this splash, I really don't know whether it would have been quite the same topic. Die Schlafwander, the Sleepwalkers, as I said, was an unprecedented publishing success, selling hundreds of thousands of copies in that first year of publication alone. That really is unusual for a history book. Topping German bestseller charts for months, triggering extensive debate among historians and in the media, where the starting point for heated discussions about the war and the origins of the war was always Clark's thesis. Christopher Clark was everywhere in Germany. There was no newspaper, there was no TV program that he wouldn't feature in. Now, Clarke's publications make several unique interventions. Crucially, he rejects, as I said, the notion of war guilt, and I think that's an important point. He denies that historians should be engaged in trying to find a guilty party in the manner of a detective in a crime thriller. Moreover, it focuses on and is more critical of the role of Serbia and the Entente powers, while being much more lenient on the actions of Germany and Austria-Hungary. For many Germans, this radical new interpretation effectively ended a century of blame. As Michael Epgenhans observes, Clarke's apparent exoneration of Germany's role in the origins of the war had, and I quote, a near magical effect on a large public audience and many German historians. With Clarke's book such a publishing success, and many journalists and large parts of the German public now convinced that the slate had been wiped clean, those who did not share the view found themselves accused of nursing a negative nationalism that clings to German self-flagellation, as one journalist put it. So 50 years after the Fischer controversy, being a Fischerite, as it was called, was suddenly an insult again, while Clarke's critics were accused of guilt pride. There's so much to unpick here, I think. It's really guilt pride. Arguments about Germany's relative innocence, or rather shared responsibility, found its way into other influential publications, such as Herfried Münkler's 2013 study Der große Krieg. I think I've got another here. Der große Krieg, the Great War. Münkler is a political scientist and public intellectual with close ties to the German government. His book also appeared for weeks on the German bestseller lists. Like Clarke, Münkler was frequently interviewed in the media, often together with Clarke, as an expert and proponent of the new orthodoxy during the German debates of 2014. He spelled out the advantages for Germany of this newly emerging consensus, of this newly emerging interpretation, rather. And I quote, "It is hardly possible to assume a responsible policy in Europe if one has the impression we were guilty of everything." So you can see the political motivation behind the wiping clean of the slate. You can then project forward to perhaps a more forceful foreign policy in future. Indeed, much of the public debate centered on Germany's future role in Europe, with many conservative historians advocating, once again, a more self-assured foreign policy for an economically powerful Germany, now that guilt, for one world war at least, had finally been removed. Got a few more minutes. Okay, so there's an interesting parallel there, I think, to the 50th anniversary, because as we've seen at the height of the Cold War, with Germany only recently divided and very much at the mercy of its allies, drawing parallels between the origins of both wars threatened West Germany's Western integration. But in 2014, a much more self-assured, united Germany confronted the history of the First World War for the first time in an unapologetic way. United Germany was firmly within a European alliance in which it had become used to playing a leading role, politically and economically at least. And so this led to a very different relationship with Germany's history, or at least with the history of the First World War. So I just want to conclude with some general thoughts about German views of the war over the last 100 years. In Germany, the urgency of arriving at an agreeable consensus about the origins of the war was always as much to do with the country's future role in Europe as it was about reflecting about its past. That was true in 1918 as much as it was in 2014 in a stronger and more self-confident Germany, when some want to see the re-emergence of that Germany as a country which no longer has to feel bad about 20th century history, or at least not all of it. And of course, you can then make the argument, well, if it wasn't Germany's fault, then Versailles was definitely wrong. So therefore, Germany definitely was in the right to try and undo it. And you do then get some people who start to talk about, well, what about the origins of the Second World War, which is really very dodgy territory. Since 1919, the desire in Germany to undo the wrongs of Versailles has always dominated German views of the First World War. Several generations later, it's still important to some Germans to show that the Allies had been wrong in 1919, and this remains a motivation for the continuing debate. Now, I don't know about you, but I always like to look at reviews on Amazon, and the reviews of Christopher Clark's book on the German Amazon website are fantastic, hundreds of them, and you get a real sense of what people who read those books think and how they read and discuss. So here are some quotes to illustrate the point I just made. Finally, an end to the continual Germany bashing, says Elisa, on the 18th of January this year. And another review from 2014 by a customer says he, Clark, has treated the German Reich with justice. For this he deserves heartfelt thanks. Or, like an enthusiastic reader expressed it recently at a public talk in Frankfurt, Professor Clark, hooray, hooray, hooray. You wish you'd been there for that one. So in Britain, the Centenary gave rise to public discussions about the alleged futility of the sacrifices and the question of whether Britain could have stayed out of the war. Now, that's an interesting debate in itself, but in Germany, by contrast, the question of whether the war was worth fighting never arose, not least because the memory of that war was soon overshadowed, as we've seen, by the even more traumatic experience of the Second World War, but also because the First World War had always been sold to the Germans as a defensive war. The idea that the war of 1914 to 1918 had been futile is also, of course, not part of the national consciousness in countries like France and Belgium, who had no choice but to join the fighting. Theirs really was a defensive war. But for Britain, the origins of the iconic Great War are of national significance. To negate the responsibility of the Central Powers, as Clark arguably does in his book, is to call into question the legitimacy of British suffering. It even opens up the possibility that Britain had joined the war on the wrong side. Now, who caused the war matters in all of these countries, but it clearly matters for different reasons. German views of the war, or rather of all the wars of the 20th century, which affected them more than most countries, also shapes their views on Brexit. You didn't think you could get away without Brexit. You're not sitting at home listening to PM, so you've got it here. So the memory of the war has left Germans with a deep-seated fear of war and a heartfelt gratitude for now 74 years of peace in Central Europe. Thanks in no small part to the EU, they feel, Europe has become a safe and stable place, unlike in 1914. German views of the First World War are inextricably entwined with views of the Second and the Cold War, and with views of the history of the 20th century, which foreground a desire for lasting peace. Or, as another reviewer by the name of Hilsheimer put it on German Amazon on the 3rd of June 2016, we are glad that today we have the EU, 5 exclamation marks. This is a feeling that Luxembourg's Prime Minister Jean-Claude Juncker, whom we hear so much about these days, summed up in a speech again in the German Bundestag on the occasion of the 90th anniversary of the end of the war, where he said, "Whoever doubts Europe, whoever despairs of Europe, should visit war cemeteries." He could not have foreseen that 10 years later, the centenary commemorations would be conducted against the background of that very doubt in some quarters. Now, Germans may not be able to answer the question, what concern of ours is the First World War? But their memory of both world wars has certainly led them to value the long peace that followed. Thank you very much.